And what led you to sign up for the training?
We know so little about what really goes on in the system of the soil and all. Basically, what's the biochemistry that really makes this thing tick? And that intrigues me. And any opportunity to learn
Right.
or to expand on what's really happening and how we impact it is really important to me, because that's our resource base.
Right.
And here's our resource base, and we don't completely understand it.
And so that might go into the next one, is your traditional education avenues, that biochemistry just wasn't getting discussed or not at a level.
Well, it's one of the things I've said for a long time. We look, I've been looking at soils and soil tests and management systems for a long time, but we've looked very hard at the physical, we've looked very hard at the chemical, but the bio part of it, we just really hadn't tied it all together like we should.
From the trainings, have you changed any part of your system on the farm?
Yeah, really, because being in an organic system, we're suspect as far as the amount of tillage that we do, for weed control, which is something that we kind of have to do. And I've been on a course for several years trying to figure out what are the cyclical botanical systems that I could put in place whereby we could continue to synergize the system naturally without additional tillage, get life cycles to complete themselves where it would support a following crop, necessarily without tillage. But that's difficult to do. We don't have all of those designed for our particular latitude perfectly. What works in one season might not in another. So I would say that our primary concern was how do we continue to compete in an organic system with less tillage, and then what's the effect of that?
Right.
Do we cultivate like Gary does? Absolutely not. Would we like to? Probably not. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. We're trying to get to no-till. I'm trying to get away from that cultivator. I'm trying to plant crops that I can put in, that can compete, and I can take back out. And you'll see one where we establish the permaculture.
I'm making a presentation, or supposed to make a presentation at Practical Farmers of Iowa in January on the whole concept of organic no-till.
Oh, great.
And, how do we approach it? And I have, frankly, I have an idea of how that might go, but it's not going to be a teaching moment, it's going to be a discussion moment.
Right.
Who's doing what and how do you do it? And from my perspective, maybe long-term no-tillers will be better equipped to maybe adapt into the organic system of no-till than maybe long-term organic producers that have not been no-tillers, and that might be a little more difficult for them. So you have those two factions, and how do you approach that, and what will the discussion be, because it needs to be very open, because I don't think anybody has all the answers. And I think many of those answers vary, just like a lot of other management systems with respect to how you run an operation at a given location. A lot of situations are circumstantial with respect to, your topography, your geography, your latitude, everything.
That's how, the next question is how you changed how you talk to others about soil health. I used to make a couple blanket statements, and I realized through this training that you can't. But have you changed how you approach it?
Yeah, I don't know whether I've really changed how I approached it, because I've always kind of approached it with the fact that, first of all, I don't know much.
Right.
So how can I tell somebody else that they don't know much? Because a lot of the folks that you talk to, they're comfortable with what they know and where they are and the amount of success that they've had, and they don't want to be shaken out of that position. I know that's been the case with some of the endeavors with cover crops. You know, some people will just outright reject cover crops because it forces them to change one particular management system that they have down pat, and and very often it's the more sizable operations that are a little bit inflexible because they like where they are and they don't want to shake that position.
I think this was at least the most realistic education that I've been a part of when it got to like legitimate management steps and logistic cycles. In our typical NRCS training, it was just very high level, like the science behind it. So I thought at least that kind of helped when you talk with a farmer from an agency perspective, that you're understanding their cycles more, their management challenges.
Well, there are a lot of people who won't make a move until they have the science. I'm not going to make a move that they don't necessarily have any kind of an intuitive sense of maybe where we could be.
Right.
Well, if we go back and look at the science, we have done two or three things with science, two things in particular. We've dropped a lot of what we already knew because we came into a synthesized system that we thought sort of changed that, and we didn't need what we knew. And that goes clear back to the early 20th century. With some of the cover crops, some of the nitrogen fixing options we had with crops, and then some of the allopathic effects of natural allopathic effects of some of the weed control systems. We knew those things in the 20s and 30s. We had a lot of that. Then here lately, we're also finding out that maybe our potash tests and things like that weren't all that accurate. And some of our soil tests that we consider to be, this is perfect science, is not. We kind of knew that. I made that statement to a group of lady landowners after, I think it was the 1974 Farm Progress Show that was, whatever year it was, where it was near Taylorville. And I was invited to speak to some lady landowners. And I said, well, I made the statement that a soil test is a guess at best. Yeah.
Didn't Einstein say, like, if you can't explain it simply, you don't know what you're talking about?
Well, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So for that first one up in Bloomington, that was really more of the primer for soil health to try to get us all on the same page. I think the big learning outcome was, did you come away from that class having an understanding of the 4 principles of soil health that Barry talks about? And then too, that was really only maybe one of our workshops that worked on when you're in a soil pit, what do you look for and how could you explain the physical changes to a farm group that this is their first time looking at soil health. So I think those were the main objectives.
How many of the folks that were involved in this had never been in a soil pit? You don't know that, do you?
Right. I bet more than half had never led a soil pit, discussion at a field day.
We had dug soil pits on this farm, on a couple of our other farms back in the 80s. We had Al Troust from the National Soil, the Tillage Lab, Auburn, Alabama. I'll forget what we had him come up and we did stuff in a soil pit years ago, and he was so good that he told us what tools we used.
Oh, okay.
He'd take a trowel down in the soil pit and okay, you used a C-shank cultivator and you used a 7,000 deer planter and he was right. And he didn't have any of the history. So from a physical standpoint, we understood that part of it. The other thing that we were introduced to then was the extent of a root system of, say, a clover plant. You know, how far it went. Of course, those pits were only about 4 to 5 feet deep, and of course the clover stuff went beyond that, and so did some of the corn roots too at the time. So I had experience with soil pits and monoliths and things of that nature. But one thing that really impressed me is when we went out to the field the next day and looked at the difference that the no tillage, the lack of tillage, made in putting additional carbon and organic matter into the topsoil. That's the thing I remember most, rather than the 4 principles of Barry's presentation. What really impressed me most was how we could increase. Maybe go back and increase the soil life with a lack of tillage, and that's the first introduction into, okay, maybe my tillage is doing me more harm than good. Yeah, and having taken this particular farm and just turning it back into all grass, you know, because of the way it rolls a little bit, but also because for utilization of livestock, but it makes more sense for us to grow grass. I've listened to Ed Ballard for years that if farmers treated their grass the way they treat their row crops, more farmers would grow more grass. You know, if they manage the grass the same way. Sometimes we're our own biggest problem, simply because we get blocked out or we get cornered in a management system.
Right.
Yeah. The management system doesn't allow you the flexibility to do, what maybe needs to be done. I ran into some of those decisions this year. You know, does it make more sense to go out and cultivate the second time, or do you let it go? And if diversity is part of the key to soil health, what do those weeds contribute?
Right.
And in the long term, the question for me is, okay, it takes a while for your soil or your biological activity to sort of remetabolize itself to this lack of tillage. Is it going to be helped or hurt more by those other plant species over time? And will that short-term gain through a cultivation just to get a little extra cash for a particular crop be worth more than the long-term gain by the lack of disturbance?
Oh, this was all the soil health tests. How do you interpret them? What do they mean? What's going to be useful? All the ones that are out there.
That was extremely informative. Very complex. Are we with these tests, though, when we look at all the moving into the realm of biological testing and its value and how we interpret it, I'm inclined to go back and say, okay, I'll compare this to our experience with standard soil testing and how dogmatic we finally made it, when in fact, we were somewhat incomplete in our knowledge base. And who decides what the perfect CEC is and base saturation and all that kind of thing? How do you hit those levels? What makes that exact science for every place? So we find out that there are flaws, possible flaws, and knowledge holes, if you will, that haven't been completely filled with that system. Now compare that to where we are with the biological system. Are we going to run into the same situation where, golly, well, this is not right, it's all we know, But, 10 years down the road, we'll find out, well, no, that wasn't right either. And it's not that it's not a religion, but, we put faith in things that maybe we don't understand.
And I like the conversation maybe from the get-go started with that, or at least how to use these flawed tests to your best benefit right now.
That's where we are.
Right.
That's exactly where we are. I had Rick and Kathy Casey, he sent some tests off and had some returns come to him. I don't know if you've talked to Rick. And then one of his neighbors sent some tests off, I think. And so they made comparisons. And his neighbor's situation was extremely different from his. I know both farms. It was very different from his. But the recommendations were exactly the same. So already we've developed these questions of, okay, are there opportunists out there on a commercial scale trying to take advantage of this? Well, that's what happens in a free society with, with a capitalistic approach. I mean, it's not that there's anything wrong with it, but we're going to get sold concepts that might not have the answers. The major soil consulting people are going to seize on this and tell you they've got the answer. And for $60 you can find out what you need. Well, the other extreme of this is a good friend of mine says, you know what? I've never had a soil test, and I don't need one. And he's an organic producer, and he grows some great stuff.
Yeah.
How do you put all this together? I'm looking for those answers, and I've looked at those soil tests for years. Used Brookside for several years. We mapped the fields by topography and soil type in 1970. So we've been doing it for a long time. I don't know that I'm that much farther ahead for having done it. I don't know that. How do you assess that? How do you measure that?
Right.
I don't know. And I should be better off. I don't know that I am. For years, you pour on the potash, you got to get to 300. Well, we found out that wasn't right. In this field south of the house, we did a test out here with potash in the 80s. And 300, 400, 500 pounds a year. We could never get it to come up. Never. The second or third year after I put it in grass, it exploded. The readings came way up. I told that to Ted Peck. He said, yeah, we're finding that out. So it was the biology in the soil that really released the potash and made it available, or was our extraction system. That's the one thing we talked about in this, the extracting systems of standard soil tests, how they vary, how different they are.
Right.
And so when you're going into the biological test, you've naturally got those same questions. What method do we use? What are the metrics? How do we measure?
What is your grazing here? I mean, how are they grazed through the year?
This home farm is probably the most controlled, simply because of you always have to balance labor with the whole resource thing. And management intensive grazing is the intensity is the management. and for instance, this it used to be 31 acres, and since the state has come through, made this nice 4-lane highway, we're down to about 27 or 28, I guess. But anyway, we have it split up into 6 paddocks, and then if we stockpile for winter grazing, we'll split those paddocks and we'll put them into 12 different paddocks, and then we'll graze accordingly, and we'll use different density, different population bases. according to the growth that we have, and we think the length of time we have according to the weather. So you're always adjusting depending upon what kind of a weather pattern you're in. And then we have, so these are smaller paddocks, and then in behind we have a kind of a wagon wheel effect where we have medium-sized paddocks, about 10 acres each, and we'll put a herd of maybe anywhere from 35 to 40 cows with calves in each one of those. And so we manage this place pretty closely now. When we go away in rotational pastures, we don't manage quite as closely. We might split 100 acres.
And those, I've seen your rotational pastures, those rotate across cropland.
Yes. Yeah.
So
that's all cropland.
Right. And what would be, I mean, I guess I'm getting at what your whole rotation is, as far as, what is the extended crop rotation that includes cattle?
Well, let me back up for a minute, because I was thinking about this whole question, because one of the things that we, when we look at soil health, the reinfusion, if you will, of animals back into a system always seems to be a part of it, if you're going to be able to complete this whole soil health approach, if you will. And with where we are on the plains, so to speak, or at least on the cultivated plains of this part of the nation, is we've taken out the fence rows and the hedgerows and all the borders and parameters that we used to use to hold livestock. I mean, they're gone. So to get that back is a major endeavor. And we actually decided this year, after having gone through all of this training, that if we're going to make no-till work in an organic system, we have to be able to manage it. Part of managing no-till in an organic system is the planning ahead. If you're taking a rotational pasture that has well-rooted grasses in a rotational system, and you're going to put it back into a crop, you've got to manage those root systems, and you're not going to kill those grasses naturally without anything but tillage.
Right.
So you're going to have some tillage. So instead of tilling a piece of ground in the spring and then, using a tiller or a plow or a disc or a combination of whatever, and making maybe 3 or 4 or 5 trips before you ever get it planted, and then you're rotary hoeing it twice and cultivating it twice at least in order to get a crop. That's part of the breakdown of the soil structure in the system, and probably limiting the biological activity that you're trying to build. So the next best way to do that is, if you're going to disturb the soil, if you're going to come out of those rotational pastures, you probably need to be doing it at a time of the year which is least impactful on that biology. That's probably going to be midsummer when you're dry, somewhere in the August, September, late July, sometime in that time frame, depending upon what your rainfall and temperature scale is. This year, perfect. But I can tell you, some of those were hard as a rock. The whole idea being that okay, then we can put a cover crop in there, like an oats hairy vetch, or some kind of a combination of a cover crop that you can either winter kill or you can roll at a bloom time and no-till a corn crop into it.
Right.
And your disturbance period was when it would least affect maybe the beneficial biology in the soil. So we've taken 2 farms and we actually redesigned the rotational system so that we could do summer tillage in preparation for a no-till corn crop, which we can come back with the rye and no-till soybeans into the rye. And if the soybeans, if we get the good weed control and we get good coverage, which we didn't get this year, but if we do get it, theoretically, then we can come back with a no-till rye crop. Or probably, if you're going to come back in the spring, though, you're going to have to do light tillage if you're going to use oats. And you may have to do light tillage even in the fall. I don't know if you're going to do a wheat crop or something. But rye, you could probably get away with it because it's just so prolific. I mean, the winter rye will take off under almost any conditions. So there you would get through a cycle, and then we'll come back with the grass legume mix for a rotational pasture behind that. So in one farm that's a 5-year rotation. On another farm, it's a 6-year rotation according to the way we design the field. So on one farm, we actually took 110, 105, and a 94-acre field. Basically, it's a half section of land with drainage ditches and stuff, breaking it up. And instead of 3 fields, we made it 6. And then we took another 400-acre farm, and instead of 3 fields, we made it 5. So that we could manage those into a more biologically friendly rotational system. Now, otherwise, we're on roughly a 7-year rotation on some of the other ground and these have livestock on them. Those fields have livestock, or those farms. Where we don't have livestock on some of those, we're in roughly 7-year rotation, and we'll have two open or meadow years out of the 7. But those are basically going to be tilled unless we adopt this other measure of summer tillage. And we were not very successful. I mean, if you'd look at the field, you'd say, whoa, with no-till corn this year. We just simply weren't successful. And it looked like when we tilled it, when we planted it, it was perfect. So maybe we haven't remetabolized that system to the point where it's adjusted yet. I don't know. That's where we really got into the whole, managing cover crop thing. And really a lot of it concentrated on rye and what species or versus VNS, and Barry had the experience of VNS rye, and then just the difference in seed selection and variety selection of a cover crop can make a huge difference in a management system. Yeah, and I've got non-organic neighbor that they got some rye from me a few years ago and started in a particular field next to me of no-till, and their no-till corn this year, even though they had to replant a little bit of it, very little of it, like a little pond. It was a 40-acre field. They planted otherwise replanted 1,000 acres. And I said, well, how was that corn? He said, made 202, but he said some of my other corns made up to 230. I said, but look at the expense you had in it. Yeah, he says, quite a bit, and he's already put cover crop on his corn stalks, and it's growing right next to me. But he's got a rye and a mix, and for going to beans next year. So, they raised their own rye. I gave them the original seed, and then they've raised their own rye. So, it's creeping,
right?
But it's slow because we've got the pretty good size operators that are pretty comfortable with where they are. I think you do it. You can speak it, you can talk about it, but doing it.
Right.
Doing it. Actually doing it. Even though in our case this year we look like we failed in a lot of things. I don't perceive it that way. I think it's part of the educational process. I can tell you one thing in my years of experience with what I'm doing. I can handle harvesting an almost impossible situation because I've done it a lot of times.
Yeah.
And sometimes it puts you at odd situations. I mean, with respect to timing, something I'm not particularly proud of, but I do have experience. I've harvested in every month of the year but May. That's just when you're out on the edge and you're trying things, these extremes happen. And so you salvage situations. Now, is that good for everybody? No. People won't take those chances. But you learn what the limits of what you can do really are.
Is that a value? Don't you see that as a value to cover people that are doing cover crops?
Yes. Yeah, I do. For instance, with food grade soybeans last year, as an example, with food grade soybeans last year, you remember how green everything stayed last year, and then guys were harvesting soybeans with a lot of butter beans in them, testing 10. Well, they went ahead and harvested, not a problem. They're not food grade. Well, ours were food grade, so we waited until we got what we needed as far as maturity was concerned. We got a little over half finished, and then we had about 200 acres of soybeans when the weather broke. And when the weather broke last year, it stayed. We didn't get back to harvest until February. So we were harvesting in February in that unusual warm spell. But within a day or two of harvesting those soybeans, we no-tilled rye in those same fields. And we harvested that rye in July. Now, it wasn't great, but we had a crop, and we had a cover crop that came up after the rye. We put red clover in behind one, and the other we did a grass legume mix. And it's all out there. It's just fine. It looked great. And we baled some great hay off of those same fields this summer. So you just keep going.
Right.
You just keep going in the system. It doesn't have to, fit in this perfect time scale all the time.
Lords who were very interested in what we were doing. They were city dwellers, and they understood what we were trying to do to grow purer food, be kinder to the soil, get away from the harsh chemistry. Little history. No anhydrous ammonia on this farm since 1969. Now, when we went organic, of course, that was out. No insecticide since 1969. Participated in a farm program once, 1966. Okay? We do not participate in farm programs. If there's anything to do with erosion control or terraces, or anything, we do it ourselves. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, it's cheaper. All you're really looking for from the government is technical help.